Well, thank you. I'm just delighted to be here. I go to a lot of conferences around the world and involved with a lot of discussion. I consider this to be particularly a high level of exchange on the water industry, and some of the great things you're doing in Texas are certainly considered best practices. I know I've got to be conscious of the time. We've talked a lot about Texas. I've got the whole rest of the world to talk about in 30 minutes, so I'll try to be selective. Give you a little bit more of my background. You recognize from my accent I'm not from some of the countries I'll be speaking about. I was in Southern California for a number of years, did most of my work there. Back in about 2005, 2006, I got heavily involved in Australia, mainly because Australia was looking to the US for water solutions for the drought they were experiencing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So that got me over to Australia. I then moved up to Singapore. I was the managing director of our Asia Pacific region, so that encompasses Australia, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, those vast countries over there. Got very involved with the Singapore market, now back in Northern California. Still very active in the global markets. Just got back from a trip from Asia Pacific for the last 3 weeks. I got back last week, so I'm pretty much up to speed with a lot of that. I'm going to be providing that international perspective on really reuse and desal, but I have to put it in the context of some of their other strategies for providing water to a lot of these cities and countries. So why don't we get started with what I consider to be the biggest drama that's played out really in the world of water, I think in the last 10 years, is Australia. We heard Robert Mace talk a little bit about it over the lunch hour. They truly experienced drought beyond anything they've ever dealt with before, and they learned a lot from it. I think they're a much stronger economy because of it, but they've dealt with a lot of the factors that Texas is experiencing today. Just a quick refresher on geography, because it's important to understand the story. One of the previous speakers mentioned that most of the cities are along the coastline. You have Brisbane, Sydney along the east coast, coming around down south. You have Melbourne, Adelaide, and then all the way over on the west is Perth in Western Australia. An important line of demarcation is that Tropic of Capricorn. I heard the earlier speaker talk about where we're seeing the most impacts from climate change. Is it in these mid-level latitudes? Well, this Tropic of Capricorn is really the separation point from the tropical region that's north of that and the southern temperate zone that's south. And as you can appreciate, all the water is on the north half of the country, and all the people are on the south half. So that just creates some natural challenges. And here's how the story really goes. The graph on the top, or the graphic on the top, is really the last 10 years, 2001 to 2010, when the drought was all playing out. If you can imagine what you've heard about Texas and you've been experiencing in Texas for the last 3, 4 years, if that was extended for another 3, 4, 5 years, how that would play out. And that's truly what was happening in Australia. Again, you see the most challenged areas where the highest populations were, and the water sources up at the north. You wouldn't believe the number of politicians that came up with the solution, well, let's just build a pipeline from the north to the south. Unfortunately, that's really very impractical, even in California, where we have the long state water project moving water from the north to the south, about 700 miles of canals and pipelines and pumps. This would be 3 or 4 times that distances in most cases. So it just economically does not make sense to try to move water that great distance. So they did have to go to alternative water supplies as their primary means of dealing with this. And it really became a tale of two countries, in my opinion. The eastern side was probably not as well prepared for this, yet had most of the population. And the western side of the country saw it coming and really put some plans in place that paid out very well for them. So there's a contrast there that I think we can all learn from. We'll start by talking a little bit about Oh, and the most important thing I should mention about this slide is, sure enough, about the time all this infrastructure got put into place, the rains came. And that's the second graphic down below. And it rained, and it rained, and it's still raining in many parts of Australia. So, you know, the politicians just were lambasted that, you know, decided to go to some of these exotic solutions, you might call them. But it still, I think, makes a lot of sense. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So in Queensland, where probably the most drama played out, this is the way it looked. The reservoirs were steadily dropping from the early 2000s. 2001, they were at 100% capacity, to you get to about 2007, the height of it, and that is when the reservoir levels were down at 15%, and their total supply was down to 15% of what it traditionally had the capacity for. And at 15%, that's almost out of water, because we heard some talk about the sediments that come into play, the higher turbidities, the challenges of treating that water. This was a dire situation, no doubt. In about 2005, Queensland got very serious about what are we going to do. They had a booming economy. Their population was booming. They do a lot of natural resources work there, mining industry, oil and gas. That continued to grow, and yet they were running out of water. So quite the drama. This is really the first step they elected to go to. I think Robert Mace mentioned the Western Corridor project and some of the things they elected in Queensland. But they started with a large recycle scheme that took the wastewater effluent from their major plants in the Brisbane area, where most of the population is. Decided to go to 3 new advanced wastewater treatment plants, which would then supply water up the pipeline, up into the supply system, primarily to supply energy plants, power stations. We heard the previous speaker talk about the connection with the energy. Absolutely, that was their biggest threat, that they were going to run out of water to cool their power stations, causing brownouts, potentially blackouts, and their economy would come to a complete collapse. So that was the first order of business. And then, in addition to that, if it really got bad, they were going to take the water back up to the top of the Wivenhoe Dam, which is their largest source of water supply in the Queensland area, and add it back into the system there and let it come down through the traditional water systems. Here it is in schematic form. There was effectively 3 advanced water treatment plants. Oops. My fault, if we can get back. There we go. Anyway, I'll just point to it. The Luggage Point Advanced Water Treatment Plant, the Gibson Island, and the Badamba plant over here. Black & Veatch actually worked with an Australian consulting company to develop this plan. It was eventually taken over by the state. One of the primary reasons Queensland got themselves, I think, into the trouble they did, and many would argue this, this was the reason, is that they had a very fractionalized, fragmented water structure. A lot of small utilities, councils, towns, cities that had their individual solutions to water. And as this drought kept getting worse and worse, they were not able to come together with regional solutions until the state finally took it over. And they took over this Western Corridor plant. They then realized they needed to implement it immediately. My company, with an Australian contractor, did a design-build project, an emergency basis for the Badamba plant. We were given 1 year to get that up and running, and we were able to do that. But the other 2 plants have now been added as well. And indeed, it's supplying primarily right now, because the rains have come, those 2 power stations, the Tarong and the Swan Bank Power Station, up further into the grid. This gives you an idea of the situation they were facing in 2007. Premier Beattie was effectively the governor of, as we know, governor of Queensland, and the voters had just rejected reclaimed water, recycled water in a vote about a year earlier in Toowoomba. Some of you may have heard about that. But it got to the point where the state really just had to take hold of the situation. It was an emergency basis. And here's the quote from the premier saying that it's really do that or die. This all played out with water restrictions as well. They enacted different levels of water restrictions based on triggers. I think that's a very important lesson learned from Australia, is to set your plans with specific triggers, get those communicated to the politicians, to the general public, and then as the situation becomes worse, if it does, you'll have a plan in place, you'll have the understanding why you're going to certain levels of either restrictions or investment in infrastructure. So these gradually got worse, and I heard the question with the last speaker. There was a bit of an unintended consequence. As they mandated further and further restrictions, obviously that cut back on the effluent going to the wastewater treatment plants. It then cut back on what went to the advanced water treatment plants. And quite frankly, by the time we got done building that Bundamba plant, the state was challenged to get us the effluent we needed to fully commission that plant. That's how low the flows were coming through that recycled water system. So lessons learned, as you plan out these solutions, you really have to think about the consequences if you get to the point where you're virtually running out of water. Today, this is the way Southeast Queensland infrastructure looks, the water infrastructure. It's very robust. They went far beyond just the advanced water treatment plants. They did also, on an emergency basis, put in desalination. One of the reasons is that's climate independent. As previous speaker mentioned, most of the major cities in Australia now have seawater desalination plants because it's not tied to the rainfall or the wastewater streams. They also put in a very massive pipeline system to interconnect all of these water supplies. It's vitally important to get that diversity and that interconnection. So as you see one water supply running short or failing, or there's some vulnerability in that system, you have alternative means and it can be moved around well. So I was living in Australia when this was all playing out, and it was all front page news. There was billions of dollars of impact to the local economy because the water was running out. And keep in mind, agriculture is a lot of that as well. And I mentioned the resources industry that needs a lot of water. And when these rains first started to come, they actually quoted that that was a $2 billion, that rain over the last month generated $1 billion of additional economy to the state of Queensland, just because they were able to replenish their water systems. So I would argue that even though these investments have cost, I think, $7.5 billion in 5 years, it's money very well invested for the state of Queensland and for their future as they continue to grow in the Southern Hemisphere. The other side of the country, Western Australia, they really saw this coming. They tracked their inflow levels into the dams in Western Australia, primarily around Perth, where their population is based. And you see from the early 1900s to the 1970, that black line represents the average inflow to their reservoirs. Then you look at from 1970 to roughly the beginning of 2000, that was halved. Then you look at 2000 to about 2005, halved again. And then I've taken it all the way up to about 2010. It continues to decrease. So they are very convinced that they are in the canary in the coal mine of climate change, climate variation. And about 2000, their CEO at the time, Jim Gill, for Water Corporation, decided he needed to take action. They came up with some very robust plans. They started by putting a plan together that was later named Water Forever. They realized that they could not be dependent on just the rainfall in Western Australia. So they very much looked at water reuse solutions, desalination solutions, water conservation solutions, and they have good groundwater in the Perth area, and they were planning on tapping that. Unfortunately, that source did not play out for political reasons, but the plan called for a backup of putting in desal. So about 2005, 2006, they initiated the first major seawater desalination plant in Australia and completed that about 2007, helping to ensure their water supply going forward. The Water Forever plan, as it's still called, has just been added to that name. It's called Water Forever, Whatever the Weather, implying that they're not going to be dependent on rainfalls in Western Australia. One of the reasons Western Australia, I think, did a much better job of seeing this coming and being able to respond to it is that Western Australia is effectively overseen by one utility, Water Corporation. So they were able to come up with those regional solutions, were able to mobilize the politicians, the general public behind their solutions, and it played out very well for them. Here's that first PERTH seawater desalination plant. At the time, it was very controversial, especially with the energy usage. This was all the time of the Kyoto Protocol and some of the carbon emissions issues. Seawater desalination is obviously high in energy use. Being very, very forward-thinking, they're using wind power to provide the energy for this facility. And that's really the standard in Australia today, to use renewable energy sources to power, especially seawater desalination, but in some cases even recycled water. They have gone on now to their second desalination plant, and that was commissioned in 2011. And they just started the expansion of that second plant. They're going to get up to about 100 MGD of desalinated water for the Western Australia PERTH market, so significant part of their water supply. I'll just mention briefly, they're equally investing in recycled water. In this, they have recycled water for industrial use already, but now they're investing heavily on really what the previous speaker talked about was some of the solutions you're seeing in Southern California of treating the water and then injecting it into the groundwater system and then taking it out further downstream. This is what they call the GWRT plant, groundwater replenishment trial. This is a 5 MLD, which is about 1 MGD plant. It's a facility that we designed and built. It was commissioned last year. It's going to have a 3-year trial period, after which they're going to go to full implementation and take effluent from their major wastewater plant there in Perth and inject it into the groundwater and have it pulled out further downstream, similar to what they're doing in Southern California. As far as water recycling as a whole in Australia, this is what the picture looks like. Those utilities I just mentioned, Water Corporation, Southeast Queensland Utility, are projecting that 30% of their water supply going forward will come from recycled water. That's consistent with the national projections for the Water Commission there. So very significant part. I heard Robert talk about, I think, roughly 10% maybe here in Texas. And I heard Robert Puente talk about something like 16%. I was impressed with what they're going to be doing in San Antonio. But they're projecting to go to 30%, and this is down the road, this is 2013, but still a significant part of their future water supply. And similar map to the one we just saw in Texas, here's where those plants are scattered around Australia. They're well dispersed. It's part of every utility's plan going forward is to recycle their wastewater effluent. Highly treated. They have very high standards for that effluent, so I'm sure that'll continue that direction. Of course, all this comes at a price. You can see the increase in their water rates going forward, really a doubling, tripling of over time, about 7 or 8 years there. But the general public understands the need to invest in this area, not only for their general well-being, but also for the economy. I'm going to just briefly talk about Singapore. And I've really developed a healthy respect to Singapore. And that's another country that Australia was very much looking to as they were going through some of their issues. Singapore has a water scarcity issue that is not obvious. They have 92 inches of rainfall a year on average. It rains almost every day. I was living there for 3 years. It also sun shines every day. It's very tropical. It's right on the equator. But it's an island, and all that precipitation just runs off. And they're really challenged to provide the industry and their population with what they need for water supply. So they've gone to some very simple concepts. They've communicated extremely well to their public. They have 4 national taps. They are imported water from Malaysia. Now there's some political issues that go with that. They have their catchment water, what they can actually collect there in Singapore. They have recycled water, and as Ellen, I think, mentioned, it's called new water. And finally, they have desalination. We'll just touch on those briefly. The local catchment water, what's particularly impressive is that for an island like Singapore, they're now able now to capture, collect, and treat 2 out of every 3 drops of water that fall on that island. And that's through building impounding reservoirs. That's through, they've recently dammed up the Singapore River to create a larger catchment, a freshwater catchment, and pump that back up into the system. Their goal is to get to 90% capture rate of what falls in Singapore. That's truly best practice. Second is imported water. I mentioned Malaysia. They have 2 agreements, or had 2 agreements in place. They let the first one expire. Again, there's political reasons why Singapore would like to be self-sufficient. They have an agreement going all the way out to 2061, but their plan is to gradually wean themselves off of imported water very quickly. The new water, just amazing what they've done there. They actually have 5 new water factories now, they call them. They already supply 30% of the water in Singapore, primarily for industrial use. They do use some of it for putting into the reservoirs, a small percentage of it. What's amazing is the communication they've had around this over the last 5 to 10 years. I'd say almost every school child knows what new water is, knows the processes it's gone through to be processed, and is comfortable with the concept. They've got an amazing visitor center, the New Water Visitor Center, that I recommend everybody visit. But they've really educated their public on how important this water source is and why it makes sense for them to use it. And then lastly, desalination. They went to their first plant in 2003. We were actually the designer of that plant. That's been very successful. They use it on a moderate basis, just depending on how much demand is. But it's still there when they need it. They are just recently commissioned their second plant. We're the owner's engineer for that. It's in construction. It's 70 MGD, so another very significant water supply for them going forward. Here's just a roll-up of what their desalination and reuse looks like today. I mentioned the 5 plants, the new water plants. They're all across the island. They have interconnecting sewers and distribution lines, transmission lines to major industry. I should have mentioned their plan is to get to 50% recycled water, making up their water supply. So I mentioned 30% in Australia. We've talked about what Texas is targeting. Singapore is targeting 50% in the coming years. So that's truly amazing. But it's just part of their supply system now. And then the 2 desalination plants are over on the western part of the island in an area called Tuas. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm out of time. I'll leave some time for questions if we have it. I will mention just a couple other things. Very active in Hong Kong, was just meeting with them, their water supplies director and their sanitation director. They are very much adopting reuse, recycled water, and they're going to trial desalination as well. Hong Kong is another water-rich island. They've really advanced their water supplies, mainly because it goes back to when they were part of the British Commonwealth. The ties to mainland China were not too strong. That's since changed, obviously, and they use a lot of imported water now from China. But they still have a very good discipline and awareness of the importance of water. So they are already starting to go to recycled water and desalination. I'll just mention maybe what some of the takeaways are for what we see as best practices, and this is really not just Black and Beach, but this is, I think, a lot of the utilities that we've been working with in this part of the world. Develop those comprehensive water resource plans that account for the climate change that's likely to come and the supply risk, the vulnerabilities in the system. Set triggers for actions and restrictions. get those communicated out and communicate on the basis of the resilience of the system. One of the biggest faults we see everywhere, and we've talked about here at this conference, is tying water infrastructure investment to rainfall. It takes years for these plants to get put in place, and you have to tie it to the resilience of the system and the importance it has to the overall economy. Diversify the sources. Robert talked about that. That's absolutely critical, and it really needs to include recycled water, reused water, and desalination when it's available, either from brackish sources or seawater. And lastly, we heard Robert and others talk about conservation and demand management. That is the low-hanging fruit. You're not going to be able to completely make up your water supply through conservation, but it certainly is part of the equation. So with that, thank you very much.
We have time for some questions, but I have to ask the first one.
Sure.
I know everybody else is thinking about it. In those Australian water use restrictions, what is the medical exclusion for the ban on outdoor hoses?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'm not going to be able to get you the specifics of that. Maybe I can get back to you on it. But I will say, when you talk about restrictions on water reuse, one of the first things to go was any watering of yards there. They completely went brown, and they used satellites to monitor if there was anybody with a green yard. Immediately the enforcement would come in if their neighbors didn't turn them in first. So the yards went brown. Yes, the next thing that did go was the outside use of hoses for watering your car or washing your cars. You could use condensate from your air conditioning system to wash your car, but you could not use it from a hose bib. So they really got quite draconian there toward the end. Some of those are still in place, by the way, and what's interesting is that that they probably dropped their usage by about 20% through some of those restrictions, and even when they've been lifted, they've stayed down at that lower level because they're kind of ingrained now in the culture to use less water.
I'm trying not to think of other ways to wash your car, right?
Yes, please.
So to go back to Australia and compare it to the United States, here in the United States, it looks like we have a fair number of brackish aquifers that could be used for desalinated water. Is that true in Australia as well? For inland Australia, not just coastal?
Not so much. They're not as blessed with groundwater as you are here in Texas. In Western Australia, they do have, I had a slide, but I took it out. They have two aquifers, one at high level that they actually use for bore water. They do some yard irrigation with that. And then the deep one is the Yarragadee aquifer that is actually fresh water. But they don't have the abundant brackish water. If they did, I'm sure they would tap those because it would be cheaper than the seawater, those seawater desalination plants.
My question is, now that they perhaps have, at least in the short term, adequate water supplies, how are they operating the desal plants? I mean, one of the challenges with reverse osmosis is you can't run it up and shut it down and mothball it when you don't need it very easily. And so how are they trying to operate that?
As a base load, and same thing with Singapore. That's exactly the issue with seawater desalination. You have to turn it down to some minimal level. You can't turn it off very easily and restart it when you need it. So it's just built into their cost structure now. I know in some places they're down to about 10% of that usage, but they do need to exercise those membranes and those RO systems.
Back on Australia again, Mark Ellison. Recently, they have been fortunate, as we've been here in Texas, to have shale gas discoveries in Australia.
Gas, yep.
Coal seams shale gas. And how is that going to? How are they looking to use their water assets, where water demands for the shale gas, water demands for the coal mining, and their other uses? And I believe China's facing some of the same things. North Africa, where all these other shale gas deposits are in water deficit locations.
Yeah, I've got a good business colleague that works for the Department of Natural Resources and Water in Queensland, where most of that shale gas is. And actually, I've been talking to him about this since about 2005. And they're looking very closely at what we're doing in the U.S. and looking what kind of restriction and regulations we're going to put on that. I will say what they're focused on is trying to reuse some of that water. both the injection water as it comes back out, put a little potable plant in place so it can be recycled and then re-injected. You can really cut down on your water use for that. They're getting away from the evaporative ponds that are still out there in the industry. We'll see where it goes. You know, that's all driven by economics and environmental protection, but they're very aware of that, and they're gradually implementing new regulations.
Hi, Laurie McLaughlin with the Comptroller's Office. I'm curious on the coastal desal, exactly what environmental considerations there are between the intake and the reject water pipes. Looking at our own Gulf of Mexico,
Yeah.
Do you have the intake pipes close to shore and the reject waters far out from shore? How does that work?
Yeah,
And what would you consider in that calculation?
That issue was what they zeroed in on in Perth when they really put in their first desal plant for all of Australia. Now most of those major cities have them. The reason that was of primary interest, where you see most of the desalination is in the Middle East, and they don't have the same environmental standards, say, as the U.S., as Australia. So they were very concerned about, A, the impact to aquatic life, and B, the brine return to the sea and how it would be dispersed. It's not really as simple as you need X amount of feet between the two, but they did extensive studies on that. They continue to monitor that today. They've got a lot of good currents running through there, so they're actually to get a lot of mixing, and the impact has been minimal in Perth, and I'm not as aware in Sydney and Queensland and Melbourne. Well, Melbourne's not done yet, but Sydney and Queensland are done, but I'm sure that that's been taken into consideration. They, you know, as far as the intakes and the outtakes, they're quite far apart in both of those locations. Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Rob.